what I call brilliantly stupid. If he's not, he's going to look into the microscope and see what he thought he would see what he meant to see what he wants to see. And a good scientist absolutely never does that.
Trout is the director of the Infant Parent Institute and a longtime therapist who trained under renowned psychoanalyst Selma Fraiberg. Michael is a widely published scholar. His work includes the co-authored text, See Me as a Person, Creating Therapeutic Relationships with Patients and Their Families. The practice of observation is central to work with children in both early childhood education and clinical settings, albeit for considerably different reasons. We know that any practitioner brings to their field a wealth of knowledge, experiences, and theories that contribute to the lens through which they see the child in front of them. Widespread discourses about what distinguishes a good teacher or good therapist also imply expertise, perhaps demonstrated in knowing what's wrong with the child or knowing what to do with or teach a child. In contrast, you suggest the value of being, quote, brilliantly stupid. What a radical departure from knowing. What is it that you mean by being brilliantly stupid?
Well, I have this idea that folks like us in psychotherapy, casework, education, and so on are actually scientists and have a responsibility to be scientists. And that means to me a lot of things, but key among them it is that we agree to carry with us everywhere we go all that we know. But when we step up to that microscope, don't think we already know what we're going to see. A good scientist is always open-minded, always what I call brilliantly stupid. If he's not, he's going to look into the microscope and see what he thought he would see what he meant to see what he wants to see. And a good scientist absolutely never does that. Oddly enough, a good scientist would give us a hard time when we extol our ideas before ever meeting the patient or the child. So it means to me to know that we want to have the most open mind possible, not because we're nice people, not because we're liberal arts people, but because in fact we aren't, because we are scientists and we desperately, passionately want to know what's going on with this child or this parent. And the only way we can do that is if we erase all our prejudices, all our ideas ahead of time, avoid what, forgot who said, but Dan Siegel loves to quote this fellow as saying, we're prone to have hardening of the categories, which means almost what it does with its hardening of the arteries. We already think we know what's the matter with this child because we have certain diagnostic categories in our mind, and we look at the child and we say, and we slip him into one, job done. And curiously enough, there are plenty of IEPs around this country today. I hate to say this, it's so awful, but plenty of IEPs this morning where exactly that and not much more is being done. A child is being slotted into a category, the forms are being signed, and everyone goes home thinking they know something when they really may not know anything.
That's a really important point because, of course, often what we decide to do with the child is based on what we think we know about that child. And those plans, whether it's a plan for therapy or a plan such as an IEP, are constructed based off those diagnostic assessments, those classroom observations, and collaboration with families. But you've talked a lot about how a diagnosis can't predicate a specific plan. It can't dictate a plan based on knowing that a child has been diagnosed as autistic, for example. And in your work, you foreground Claire Winnicott's concept of holding that is also implicit in Donald Winnicott's practice and implicit in Selma Fraiberg's practice. Can you define holding for us? What's our goal in that work?
It's interesting that you asked that question in the context of your earlier remarks about diagnosis and assessment, because it turns out that holding really is a requirement of assessment. You just don't get anywhere with parents or with children if you already think you're so smart that you've almost got the job done of figuring them out before you ever meet them, and much less before you leave the room. So Fraiberg taught us, for example, and by the way, she was a terrifying person. So if you were ever doing an assessment for her, you would never think that she would think this way. You would think, oh my God, I've got to get these forms right. I've got to figure out what's the matter with this child so I can tell her so she doesn't yell at me. But truth is, she would walk into a room and know for a fact, you don't start off asking a child questions. Children don't like to answer questions. Children want to feel safe with you. So the very first thing you do if you're doing a diagnostic assessment is find a way to help the child feel held by you. And so one example I particularly like from her early writings was about a child asking her who broke this toy fire truck in her office. And instead of answering that, she knows that what he may really be saying is, I wonder what happens to kids in your office. I wonder what's going to happen to me. I wonder if I want to talk to you, therefore. And so she goes right to that worry, that fear. And that is an act of holding. And then she says, oh, sweetheart, the little boy that was in here earlier broke that. And he then says, well, what did you do to the boy? And she said, oh, sweetheart, I don't get mad at children. Done. Now we're ready to start the session. Now there's been some holding, and there's therefore a prayer that we're going to be able to move forward with testing, including paper and pencil testing, but also observation and play and so on. So I think it's important not only for diagnostic and assessment workup, but of course it is for observation and for the beginning of a therapeutic relationship. The other, whoever he or she is, a baby, a child, a parent, or a group of those, a dyad, needs to know that what we're really interested in is how things work here. And so if we're sent out by child welfare to investigate, not investigate in the child protection sense, but in the therapeutic sense, what's happening in this trailer where it is alleged mom's been beating this little girl, how shall we proceed? How will they feel held? It's almost guaranteed that they won't. At least the mom won't, because she knows who we are. She knows who sent us. She knows what the stakes are for making a good impression today. And so she's so out of sorts that she orders us out of the house before we ever get our coat off. She's enraged. And in her spewing of rage and words, which, by the way, hits us very hard, particularly if we're young and worried about making a good impression to our supervisor back home, she says, look, damn it, if you really want to bother somebody, you just drive around here trying to find homes to mess with people. I tell you what, go down the road there and bother that lady. Now, most diagnosticians would say, displacement or transference or one of a number of categories that will describe why a parent would not want to talk to you, but would want to get you to go talk to somebody else. But what if it isn't that? And if it isn't that, or we at least can imagine it isn't, then we just listen very quietly. And she rants about that neighbor girl. Hell yes, I tell you what, I'm doing dishes here. You see, I got a window. I look right down the road. I can do dishes here. I see their little girl ride her trike out in the road. And I tell you what, she's going to get hit one of these days. And then you all, people like you, are going to say, oh, well, I guess I went to the wrong trailer. Now you can go back to thinking she's trying to get you off the subject, or you can imagine that she's on the subject. And so if you imagine that, you say, you seem to know a lot about that little girl. You really pay attention to her. She said, well, of course, I see her out the window here. I said, yeah, I know you said you saw her, but I'm also seeing that you're really worried about her. You've got a heart for that little girl down the road. I'm wondering why that is. It gets very quiet. And lo and behold, this lady that was screaming at you 10 minutes before is not making you coffee now. Let's not get carried away, but is starting to tell you the story of living in a high-rise building with her mother, who was an alcoholic and drunk every day. And this little girl would do anything to get her attention, including walking down many flights of stairs and out into the street. And one day a cop came by and grabbed her and hauled her back up and yelled at her mother for letting her go. But that's her story. And then she says, so I'm trying to do better by my little girl than my mom did. And bam, a relationship is made. She just announced, all right, come on in. I guess maybe I need you after all. That's a holding approach to assessment.
So if I could summarize two of the points that you've made so far, one is that we are scientists, but of a subjective nature. It is subjective science. And the other is that any kind of assessment that's done must always be, or perhaps always already is, done in the context of the relationship with both the child and the family.
Absolutely right, on both counts.
So I'm very struck by your characterization here and in your writing of holding as an early intervention tactic, because early intervention really evokes for me a sense of medicalization of an individual's developmental deficits, those that might be remediated through physical or speech therapy, for example. Early interventions, such as those services provided by the Department of Education or Health and Human Services programs, in my limited experience in just a few states, are not psychoanalytically informed, but rather might privilege those therapies that are considered to be evidence-based. Those might be more behavioral than psychoanalytic in nature. So I'm wondering, do you find these psychoanalytic theories and theorists to be relevant in contemporary early intervention work? I'm wondering whether someone working in early intervention could actually assume and justify this approach that, as you write, has no rule book.
I would say it's not only relevant, but get this, I think it's time-saving. I think it's good for society because it costs less when you get it right the first time. And it's, how can I say, it's respectful of the people into whose homes we're walking. We have a very big and very expensive early intervention, actually multiple layers of it, program here in Illinois. And it does very little good. And the reason it does very little good is that people are trained to walk into homes where a referral has been made, probably because somebody thinks there's a deficit. This is with babies through, I forget what it is in our state, but let's say 4 or 5. And we open our laptop, which is already pre-filled with all the forms the government demands. We open our laptop and sit at the kitchen table or in the living room, and we begin asking questions and typing. If there's even eye contact during that hour, it would be an exception rather than the rule. We then close at the end of the hour. We filled out all the forms, and we, get this, we're ready to make referrals to specialists of various kinds. And once we do that, by golly, we have provided early intervention services. That child is now, as it's usually said here in Illinois, hooked up with proper services. But what if those proper services are meaningless because we didn't get it? We didn't understand because we weren't even looking. We were just asking questions that nobody wanted to answer for the reasons we already explored a minute ago. Mom doesn't, dad doesn't, baby doesn't, child doesn't. And so we've got no real cooperation except in form filling. They're happy to cooperate with that. Because, by the way, remember that moms and dads often also would prefer that we keep this objective and concrete and just get out of there. So they're perfectly happy with this crummy assessment procedure. What if we instead looked? We just looked like a good scientist does, and we wondered. Even if all we wonder is not what's the matter with the child, but let's say with the first 5 things that mom has rattled off that the child does or doesn't do, we say, wonder what that's been like for you. What sort of baby did you anticipate? What sort of child did you dream about before you were even pregnant? What you say the child's name was Albert? Who did you name the child? Well, we were going to name him Jimmy, after my uncle that I loved so much and that took care of me when I was little. But we dropped that when we found out what was the matter with him, that he has this disability or this deficit. He's not really a Jimmy. So you're saying he's more like an Albert. Who's an Albert? She said, I don't know, just some kid, Albert. Now that is more of an assessment than we've got otherwise. We already know that mother is hurting, dad may really be hurting, and if they're hurting, the child is hurting, the attachment is at risk. And even if you establish that the disabilities or other things you're there to inquire about are completely medically related, let's just say that. They have nothing to do with attachment, they have nothing to do with anything except they're just medical conditions. Even if you say that, still the attachment between that child and those parents is critical to their even being able to follow up on procedures, follow up on things they need to do, to give the child the kind of care he desperately needs so that he doesn't get worse in these medical conditions. Is that responsive to the tone of your question?
Yeah, absolutely. I have one follow-up question for you. And as you were talking about not making eye contact with the parents or getting a child hooked up to services, and this sounded really instrumental or just operating on the child, you mentioned that what can result are services that might be meaningless to the child. And that had me wondering, as an early interventionist, then what is the kind of change that you are hoping will happen? What kind of change are you looking for in the child's life?
Oh, thank you for adding that last part. I thought you were going to ask me to change the world or change
Oh no,
institutions.
in a given child's life, other than
Yeah.
remediating something that we might see as medical, what kind of change are you hoping to enact or facilitate in that child's life?
Well, if an example comes to mind, and I always go to them first because that's how I learned best, by hearing real life things. But if this fails to hit the mark, I know you'll interrupt me or tell me. So parents say, he won't look at me. And then they say, we think he's blind. He's 9 months old now. Would you come and do a home visit and check him out? I do. What I see is a child who doesn't look at certain moments. And those moments are moments of transition. So they hand me the child right off, which I don't like very much, but I don't know what else to do at that moment. So I take him, and I notice that as he comes toward me, his head turns 90 degrees away from me and indeed won't look at me. Once on my lap, however, I notice, they don't, that he looks at a lot of other things, including them, until I hand him back to them at which point he again turns his head uh, as distinctly away from them as he can during the transition. So now we've established something that we might not otherwise have known, which is A, he's probably not blind, and B, there is something I'm thinking about transition. Now I remember he's an adoptee. Now I remember that he's not only an adoptee, but he spent 10 days in a foster home before coming with this family. And so I wonder, what did this child learn at transition moments when he was going from one person to another? Did he learn that the person he was leaving or going to was actually not permanent or stable at all and can't be relied upon? Might it be wise, therefore, defensive, but wise, to look away, to make no connection with them? And then the zinger that complicated everything. Mom says, I don't want him to look at me. Complete shocker. I thought that's why I was there, because he didn't, and she felt bad about that. I don't want him to look at me. And a few, maybe a dozen questions later, she says, I'm afraid he'll know I'm thinking about Robbie. Who in the hell is Robbie? Wonder I. Robbie, to make a long story short, is the child they had agreed to adopt of a teen mom who changed her mind at the last minute and ran away. The child they now have was the substitute child given by the agency quickly to make them feel better and forget their grief, which they have not done. So mom knows that it's true. She is thinking about that other child, and she's afraid this little boy will figure it out, and it would be better if he didn't look at her. Now, let's just say, instead of the way we did that assessment session, I went in and walked in and opened my laptop and started filling out forms, all about the vision problem. And so I'm already thinking, before I ever get there today, who are the best vision people I know for a 9-month-old? Where can I get him tested? How will I get transportation to get him there so he can get tested? Will the parents cooperate? Gee, I wonder what the implications are of a 9-month-old who can't see. Oh, I got to research more before I get there about all the various kinds of not seeing there are in 9-month-olds. My eyes would have been closed, my own eyes. I would have been blind myself. I would have gotten him services. I would have gotten him hooked up, but I would have been wrong and wasted not only a lot of taxpayer money, but worse yet, wasted this child's life.
I appreciate that anecdote. I think it's a really beautiful example of how we might think about the role of psychoanalytic theory and those therapeutic practices in early intervention, and perhaps particularly for children with disabilities, in ways that are not necessarily pathologizing, but are really concerned with the child's experiences and both physical and emotional needs alongside the parents.
Yes, exactly right.
Thank you so much for your time and thoughts, Michael.
You're very welcome.